Thank you very much for joining us. As Mark said, I'm Adam Taylor. I'm Chief Exec at Gwent Wildlife Trust. I've been very fortunate to be in the role for coming up for 3 years now. It'll be in November. So it's been a roller coaster few years, as Mark said, with everything from COVID to cost of living. But to be honest, I've been really kind of surprised, impressed and proud of how well all of the team, volunteers, supporters and everyone have done in coping with such a plethora of problems and how we've come out smelling of roses, which is good for a wildlife-oriented organisation. So obviously tonight we'll have a few speakers. After myself, I'll be introducing my colleagues Rob Mcgee and Andy Karran, and then later we'll have Professor Dave Goulson speaking. Ahead of all of their invertebrate-based talks, I will talk to you a little bit about our people engagement work, as I said. So at GWT, our vision is one of people close to nature in a landscape rich in wildlife. And to deliver that by 2030, our strategy includes a target of engaging and assisting over 250,000 people in Gwent to prioritise and act for wildlife, which is a bold ambition, but it's just shy of the kind of 1 in 4 figure that we believe we need to engage and have act for wildlife in order to tip the balance and get wildlife back into recovery. And this is a standard target that all of the wildlife trusts are looking to achieve. And we're fortunate that we have a diverse and interesting population within Gwent, and that we are able to engage lots of different people in lots of different ways. And we have great staff who are doing things on the ground, but also digitally on our nature reserves and in a whole host of other ways. So to achieve that, we're going to have to work with a lot of communities that we've not worked with as much in the past. And I was particularly glad earlier when I was just about to log on that I was listening to Radio 4's Comedy Half Hour, and Mark Steele was doing his Mark Steele's in Town episode from Pill in Newport. So if you haven't listened to it, I'd recommend listening to it because it also has lots of local snippets and laughs, and that's kind of an important demographic within our population that I'll talk about a little bit later in my presentation. This approach to kind of engaging and empowering communities and supporting them to deal with the things that they see as their most pressing needs is an approach that we call Team Wilder. So Team Wilder is delivered through an approach called community organising. And to give the dictionary definition, as it were, it's the coordination of cooperative efforts carried out by local residents to promote the interests of their community. So really, it's just a community working together in partnership on the things that they are most interested in or most concerned about. It's kind of the common life that we all have and that we can all kind of remember local communities used to be like. For me, this reflects, all that's best about the Wildlife Trust. So looking back how the Wildlife Trust began 110 years ago, this approach kind of reignites the passion and inclusivity that founded us. And thinking about that, when the Wildlife Trusts were started 110 years ago, it was about passionate communities of volunteers who came together with a vision for a world with more wildlife. And there wasn't any money, there weren't any staff, there weren't any nature reserves. But despite the fact that it's starting from this kind of very low base, the passion, the community spirit and the enthusiasm for wildlife was the thing that's led the 46 wildlife trusts in existence today to continue to grow and have a huge impact. And just to give you an idea of the scale of impact, obviously across the 46 wildlife trusts, we have nearly 1 million members. I was pleased to hear recently that apparently between the wildlife trusts, we're the 6th largest landowner in the UK. So that's spread across about 2,300 nature reserves. And we're also the 3rd largest environmental organisation in the world. So we've got more than 3,500 staffs across the Wildlife Trust, and we're working every day, hopefully on your behalf, to try and get more wildlife everywhere for ourselves, but also for future generations. So for me, a lot of what Team Wilder is about is almost recreating the fantastic ethos, passion and drive that local communities had, and trying to assist people to do the right things for them in their local environment. And for them to take more of a lead in deciding what that is, rather than us leading the charge or necessarily prescribing the approaches that should be taken. So just to explain a bit more about what community organising is and what it's not. Community organising isn't a cure-all. It's not the fact that we're saying this is the new really exciting thing and this is everything we're going to be doing. It's an approach that works really well in some contexts, but in other contexts it doesn't. So I'll talk you through 4 of our current programs of work, which are all people engagement projects, to give you an idea, firstly, of some of the work that we're doing and that we've done in the past, that we're doing at present, and that we're going to be doing going forwards. But secondly, to give you a couple of examples of what community organising looks like and what is not community organising, and why we think it's appropriate to use the different approaches in different settings. So one of the really exciting projects that we're working on is Stanford Nature Wales. So this is our first example of community organising. So we started this project, and we are continuing it by listening to the concerns of young people, so people aged 9 to 24 on this programme, and we work with them to develop their knowledge and skills to tackle the challenges that they're most concerned about. Since the programme started, and as I say, this is a pan-Wales programme with all 5 Welsh Wildlife Trusts working on this together, we've engaged over 800 young people at schools, community events, through home education, holiday clubs and regular youth groups. And during these sessions, the young people have most commonly identified climate change as their main concern. So with this issue identified, we've worked with them to educate them about climate change and the issues that arise, and teach them various techniques to mitigate and adapt to the effects of climate change. So with this learning, these young people have then gone on and volunteered thousands of hours in their local communities to implement solutions to climate change where it's affecting them the most. And this includes everything from installing rain and bog gardens to soak up rainfall and stop flash flooding in urban areas, planting hedgerows, orchards and pollinator borders, making bee homes and nest boxes, creating green roofs, and hundreds of other actions besides. And by engaging and empowering this community of young people, the community organising approach has been a huge success. And what's really fantastic about this is that it is empowering, engaging, inspiring, and educating young people to be able to take a lead. So they are going to be leading in their communities on climate action, on nature conservation for decades to come. And they are the future generations that we are trying to kind of leave the world in a better state for. And they are, you know, taking the lead, and they're able to cascade this approach and these skills and this knowledge to other people across Wales as they grow up through their lives and themselves become, you know, the responsible adults that many of us on the call tonight are. So this is the first example of one of our projects. The second one I just talk about quickly is our trainees. So in Gwent, we've recently run a trainee programme, and to provide some background, GWT have supported several trainees in recent years. We tend to have at least a couple every year. However, we identified that a major barrier for many of the trainees was that when they were considering a role in the environment sector, be that from college or from first jobs or from school, or as a change of career, that the biggest barrier for most people was that training schemes are often voluntary and self-funding is prohibitively expensive. You know, ultimately, many of these training schemes last full-time for 6 months, and it's very difficult to obviously self-fund yourself or to convince the job centre that you won't be looking for a job for 6 months because you're going to be doing a traineeship. So we identified this particular need, and we managed to secure funding to pay 5 trainees the real living wage for 6 months, and provided them with training, mentoring, all the clothing, kit, etc., so that they could become fully adept in the environment sector and environmental practice. And from that, 2 of the 5 have already gone on to employment or higher education, and the other 3 trainees have got CVs that meet the essential criteria for most of the practical jobs that they would look to apply for within the environment sector. So again, you know, huge success, fantastic project. We're really proud of it. The trainees did an amazing job, and this has been another great success. But it's not, as you will probably identify, an example of community organising. So we didn't go to a community and ask them what their biggest pressing need was. We identified that this was an issue based on our previous experience, and we secured the funding, and then we provided a solution to this community of people who are looking to work in the environment sector. So slightly different approach, not community organising, but still really valid and really valuable. The next project I'll quickly talk about is wild health. And wild health is a programme that's particularly close to my heart. At university in Essex, I was fortunate enough to study under some of the kind of leading lights of the kind of wild health movement, looking at the impacts of nature on physical and mental well-being. I wrote my dissertation on it at university, and it's something that's always been, as I say, close to my heart. This is a really important programme that's been running for about 5 years now, and in January it doubled in size due to its success. So all of the partnership organisations we work with, including the Aneurin Bevan Health Board and various others, have continued to celebrate how successful this particular programme is. And this has been designed to address the significant need across the UK for high quality, affordable, local social care in natural surroundings. So as access to natural green space, exercise, in-person interactions and mental stimulation have all been shown to improve physical and mental health, we have been implementing this programme and working with groups to do just that in a natural setting. So since January, we've regularly had 19 groups out and engaged about 350 people. And these people are coming back for regular sessions. So it's not a one-off intervention. It's that they are getting the confidence and learning the skills and the approaches and the techniques to be able to implement this and go out and enjoy green spaces and to improve their own physical and mental well-being when they need to, long after the programme's finished. So it's a long-term solution rather than a one-off intervention. And the data that we're gathering through this programme is helping to further inform the evidence. So the evidence base is really strong for this. But we're just making sure that we, again, demonstrate that actually this approach is extremely affordable and is very good for people, and means that we're not, for example, blocking, NHS GP appointments, because we can address a lot of these things. It's the prevention's better than cure often. So that's where we are with many of these schemes. And we're getting the evidence base around, obviously improved health and well-being, but also people's knowledge of and attitudes to wildlife and their connection to nature. Again, you'll notice that, like the trainees programme, this approach isn't community organising because it's extremely impactful again, but we are aware of the evidence. We have created and designed this particular programme because we know the particular levers that we should be pulling and the things we should be doing to deliver these benefits. So we've created this scheme, and then we've gone to health boards and other partners and said, this is something we think is really important. They've agreed with us, and we've been extremely fortunate through lottery, but also through the health board and other partners, that they've continued to fund the scheme and want it to grow and grow. So one of our big initiatives to 2030 is to have the wild health, or the kind of the health and well-being activities in nature, as a standard intervention across the whole of the Aneurin Bevan Health Board, and something that is socially prescribed. So something that GPs and other practitioners are prescribing to people to either do on their own or to come out for sessions led by the Wildlife Trust and other partners, so that they can also enjoy the benefits of this particular approach. The final one I'll quickly talk about is Next Door Nature. So Next Door Nature is one of our most recent projects, and this is something that's happening across the Wildlife Trust. So we're extremely fortunate. So this was funded by, it's very personal, the Queen's Platinum Jubilee Fund, and it's something that's been funded across all of the Wildlife Trusts, all 46. All of us are therefore working in communities, taking the community organising approach, working with underrepresented communities to understand their greatest needs and supporting them to address these as a community. So in Gwent, we're focusing our approach in Gwenethley, in Newport, which is one of the most diverse and least represented areas of the county amongst our supporters, but also it's an area of multiple deprivation, and it's an area with less accessible natural green space than we would like anyone in Gwent to have. So it's an area we're really keen to do more work in. And we're still at the early stages of engagement in this particular community and understanding the sorts of interventions they would like to implement. But as you can see from the Stanford Nature Wales project, the first example, we're looking forward to being able to identify those needs, address them with nature-based solutions, and build communities there that can help each other, help themselves, and that we can continue to support as they are delivering things that are really valuable and beneficial to themselves. So in terms of the difference between community organising and other approaches, community organising is best implemented when the challenges are perhaps not entirely clear, so the issues aren't well identified, and also where the solutions aren't tried and tested. So these are what we'd call a wicked problem, in as much as we're not quite sure what the problem is or how we solve it. So we have to get together as communities, have discussions about what we think might work, trial things. We'll fail sometimes, we'll succeed at other times, and we'll kind of keep working forwards like that. With both the trainees and the Wild Health Project, slightly different approach, because these are what we'd call tame problems. And by that, we mean that there's a large amount of evidence as to what the issues are and how we can address them. So rather than needing kind of leadership and working with communities to identify the issues and develop solutions, we're able to propose solutions to the identified problems, and therefore we start a little bit further down the journey. So both approaches are entirely valid, but we need to be aware that the community organising approach is something that is, although it's harder to fund, is something that will mean that we can have tangible long-term impacts on problems that previously have gone unsolved. And that's because so often when you're working with a local authority, a funder, or whomever else, they want an evidence base to tell you exactly what the problem is. They want you to have a solution to that problem, and they want to give you exactly that amount of money to help solve the problem in the shortest amount of time possible. And with many of the perennial issues, be it biodiversity decline or climate change, they're not simple answers, and we don't have all the answers. So we do need to take a longer time, address the problems in a more inclusive way, and identify new solutions and try them over time, rather than pretending that we know all the answers and turning up with a kind of pre-prepared plan. So that's where community organising and our other approach of kind of taking the evidence base and developing solutions to implement from a GWT-led perspective vary, and why we're using both approaches. With Next Door Nature, one of the things that I particularly like about the fact that we've got such a diverse group of underrepresented communities across the UK is that actually the community spirit is one of the big things that I always hark back to. When I got into conservation and started volunteering, it was that community of volunteers that I still regard as a family and still keep in touch with kind of nearly 20 years later. And I often reference my mentor, who was the warden who looked after me when I first started volunteering, Joan Pinch, who's the warden of Tiptree Heath in Essex Wildlife Trust. And that idea of community and the fact that we can put that back at the heart of what we do is really important to me. And I think we need to do more of that. So because it tugged at my heartstrings the first time I heard it, I wanted to share it with you today. And thinking back to the kind of Maya Angelou quote of people won't remember what you said or did, they'll remember how you made them feel. I just wanted to quickly share with you this short poem by George the Poet, who is our Next Door Nature ambassador, award-winning author, and penned this to launch our Next Door Nature programme. So I'll quickly play this 1-minute clip to you, and then I'll answer any questions you might have. So hopefully this will work.
Adam, just so we can't hear any sound.
That's problematic. In which case I will have to share it in the link, and I will ask you to watch it afterwards. I do apologise about that. I'm not quite sure why it hasn't worked. Yeah, it allows you to embed videos, but apparently it doesn't allow me to play the sound. So I do apologise. I wish I'd trialled that in advance. In which case I will end it there, share the link in the chat once I've finished and once I've passed over to my colleague Rob, and I will If you want to type things in the chat or put your hand up, I can answer a few questions now about community organising approach.
Adam, while people are thinking of questions, do you want to just give a feel for some of the kind of land acquisitions that we may be coming up with, and some of the kind of new species that we might be looking at? Just without obviously going into details where it's not yet finalised, but just be helpful for people to be aware.
Yeah, no problem at all, Mark. See, this was the first time I didn't talk exclusively about wildlife, and I knew I'd be made to. To be fair, it's one of my favourite things. So as Mark says, at the moment we're very fortunate to be having conversations about several new acquisitions. I can't give away the exact locations of them because they're still being negotiated, but how vague do I need to be to not give too much away? In the Valleys region, we're currently talking to two vendors who are, we're at advanced stages of acquiring land. One site's 321 acres, so that will become our largest nature reserve. And another is 113 acres, and we're talking about another kind of 40 odd acres alongside that. So between those two sites alone, that would increase our owned land by about 70%. In addition, we're talking to landowners in the Usk Valley about taking on some fantastic river meadows, which is really exciting. And also, as part of our strategy, we're currently looking at 10 vulnerable species that we're particularly going to be targeting going forwards. And we'll reveal the list of those in the coming weeks, but there are things like shrill carder bee on there and water vole. And we're going to be taking a very concerted effort to firstly do a really good, I suppose, biodiversity audits to figure out where these species are and how many they are, but also to implement a raft of measures to try and significantly increase those populations and their resilience going forwards. And that will be all the way to 2030. So we'll have the same 10 vulnerable species, which will be really targeting. And an important point to note about that is that each of them are effectively either a keystone species, so they are something that has a fundamental impact on the ecosystem or the habitat that they live within, or assisting certain species will enable us to save a habitat which will benefit many other species as well. So so that's a couple of the things that we're working on at the moment. And we've also been having conversations with local authorities and government about potential receipt of community asset transfers. So this is some cases land, in some cases buildings as well, including areas on the Gwent level. So there's a lot of exciting things happening. And I think it's going to be a bit like buses, whereby I was hoping these things would come out in a bit of a trickle, and I'd be able to kind of announce one a month or one a quarter over an extended period. And I think that possibly you'll end up with an extra thick addition of WAG land on your doorstep in about February, and you'll suddenly wonder what we've been doing for the rest of the year and why it's all happened at once. But we're beavering away very hard in the background, and as with most of these things, it's just trying to get everything signed off by funders, solicitors, etc., so that we can get it over the line. But I'm looking forward to being able to share more information with you about the exciting acquisitions we've got on board and many of the bigger projects that we're running, and to welcome you to those sites and show you what we're doing and have your input into what we should be doing next.
And just to give everybody a teaser, one of the species has a very large wingspan, but I'm not going to say any more. I think Rachel had a question. I don't know if you put your hand down again, Rachel, but Rachel Stubley?
Hi there. Yes, I did actually put my hand down. I decided I'd find out a bit more. It was basically the next door project I was very interested in, as I'm involved in the community development project, but I kind of thought I was being a bit lazy. I want to listen to George the poet and find out more about it, and then I'll come back.
No problem.
I don't have a question, but I was so happy though to hear. I love wildlife, but I was so happy to hear so much talk about people as well and involvement. I really welcome that so much, and I'm so pleased to hear that. Thank you very much.
That's great.
Thanks, Rachel.
And I think one of the things that we learned from COVID is how much people benefit from walking on reserves for mental health reasons and for just
Absolutely.
relaxing. So that's something that's stuck with us. We're seeing how we're going to use that.
There are some questions in chat. You've probably seen them.
Yeah, I was just going to that. So Adam, I think you got a question from Fiona. In what ways is GWT working with other wildlife trusts in Wales?
Oh, wow. Well, I'm glad you asked. So every Thursday, I meet with the other Welsh chief execs. We have a quick kind of catch up on a Thursday morning to make sure that we're aligning the ways that we're working. We're working through our kind of joint representative, Rachel Sharp, who works for Wildlife Trust Wales, as we call it. So Rachel does our advocacy work, and we've been doing a lot around trying to make sure that the sustainable farming scheme is as beneficial as possible. We're also working with other wildlife trusts on a whole raft of planning issues, for example. So whether it be Wildlife Trust of South and West Wales on the offshore wind that they're kind of facing at the moment. Same with offshore wind in North Wales, as well as tidal, and obviously we've got solar wind and various other things in Gwent. Also, we have put together, as you saw, the Stanford Nature Wales project. So that's a Pan Wales project, and we're all working together to deliver that work with young people and figure out how we can educate, inspire, and empower young people to take action for climate. We're working across Wales on some water-based projects. So we're looking at things such as river restoration. So we're working in partnership. At the moment, we're working with Montgomeryshire, Radnorshire, and South and West Wales on the River Wye, and even across the border, dare I say it, with the English trusts as well. So I think there's 9 of us, 9 trusts who are all getting together to do things on the Severn and Wye and trying to kind of galvanise more support for how we can make sure that water quality is top of the agenda. And the earlier example as well of kind of peatlands. So with peatlands, we were very proud to kind of lead the charge on that, and it's managed by our colleague Natalie Waller, who's head of Nature-Based Solutions. And off the back of that, we've been able to identify and scope projects on lots of peatlands across Wales. And off the back of that project, which we secured funding for all of our Welsh colleagues, North Wales Wildlife Trust have secured just over £500,000 and restored hundreds of hectares of peat bog in North Wales. So there are lots of opportunities for us to actually link up and benefit each other, and also obviously shortcut quite a lot of work, because we have the same regulation, we have the same funders, and it's always easier and better to work together because we've got slightly different ideas. So there's quite a lot going on. And a very important point that my colleague Rob Mcgee has just very rightfully said, which is the Welsh Language Network. Sorry, Rob. So yeah, Rob is our Welsh champion, and we have been working across the Welsh Trusts to improve our Welsh language skills, but also the way that we are communicating bilingually in all of our written content as well. So be that the website, magazines, interpretation panels, social media posts, and all the rest. So we've got an ambitious plan by 2030 that we will basically be moving our staff up through the language proficiency scale from A0 to A2, which is kind of starting to get semi-conversational, but at least that we can do the kind of the basics in terms of being able to communicate with people properly in Welsh as a Welsh trust.
Adam, I may have to put a time limit on you because I think we've got quite a few other questions. We got 2 questions about how we're planning to look after these new sites whilst we're reducing our reserve staff, and are we able to employ extra staff to run them? Do you want to respond to that?
Yeah, of course. Yep. So in terms of the nature reserves, we are looking at how we can have larger nature reserves which have lower intervention rates. So, sorry, technical. But basically, there is an economy of scale with management of nature reserves. So larger areas are easier to manage than smaller areas. So ultimately, with the new sites, we're looking at a mix of conservation grazing, but some cutting using larger machinery. So it shouldn't take as many days. And with many of these larger sites, they are not very high usage by the public, so they're not very highly trafficked. So there aren't as many challenges around public access and perhaps, the need to be worrying about things like antisocial behaviour, litter, etc. So there is that, and it's a constant kind of balance of how we're going to look after our current sites and what work could we do differently potentially on those. So, for example, looking somewhere like Wisewood. So Pentwyn Wisewood is one parcel, effectively, or managed as one unit, but obviously very different habitats, with Pentwyn being, unimproved and traditional, and Wisewood being a restoration site. So on Wisewood, for example, we're looking at taking down internal fences and having animals extensively graze rather than having to move animals around field to field so frequently. So it's kind of trying to figure out how we can do things in a more low intervention, natural way to manage larger areas rather than intensively managing smaller, fewer areas.
Okay. Next question was around how much collaboration was with local councils regarding land in their control. And I think Pontypool Park as well. So I think on this one, we've had a bit of some positives with some councils, some not so positive with others. So I think my answer from kind of the trustee perspective is we need to develop closer collaboration with the council, but sometimes we're finding that they're using our staff to do things that they need to do, and they're not always giving clear boundaries, etc. So sometimes we're maybe wasting our resources, which may be best elsewhere. But Adam, you may have a better answer than I can give.
Not at all, Mark. I completely agree with your sentiment. So I would say out of the 5 local authorities, we have a fairly, how do I put it, a fairly light touch relationship with 1. 2 are challenging to work with, and 2 are much easier to work with, and I couldn't possibly name them. But yeah, it is a bit of a mixed bag. But I would say that all of them are kind of, all the staff, their hearts are in the right places, and the local authorities that we are able to work more constructively with, it is almost exclusively down to resource. So with the local authorities where they are struggling to do the right things, it's not because they lack the imagination, the drive, the enthusiasm, it's literally they lack the resources. So with one of those local authorities, we're currently in conversations through the kind of community organising approach of trying to help them set up a volunteer warden scheme, because they don't have any staff doing land management. So they have a kind of, sadly, they have a manager who has to stay in the office and basically receive complaints. And then they have no one on the ground to actually deal with said complaints or do any work. So I don't envy them at all. So we're trying to assist them by saying, you know, there are lots of great people in the area who really value these accessible natural green spaces, and the local authorities own lots of great land, but they don't have the resource. We're trying to figure out other ways of empowering them. But also we're obviously still bending the ears of councillors, Senate members and others about the fact that this is important and they should be trying to invest more money. So yeah, it's a bit of a mixed bag, but we are talking to them increasingly and coming up with lots of funded projects to help both of us.
And the other thing that we're also keeping an eye on is what's happening around the M4 Relief Road. So that's not local council, but more Welsh government. So just thinking through, because I think there is potential for new solar farms to be sited near Magee or near the M4 Relief Road, proposed Relief Road, which obviously we successfully fought against. So that's something we're keeping tabs with and working with the local community as well. And we will be engaging with the Welsh Government on that. I think Sharon had a fantastic question around how we work with farmers. Obviously, there's new farming regulations coming down the track very shortly, which mirrors what's happening in England around sustainable farming initiative. So question, I think, would the GWT consider approaching farmers to persuade them to keep one small field free of crops and to replant wildflowers in order to attract bees and butterflies? Over to you, Adam.
Yes, great question. Really excited. Yeah, it's an area that I'm really passionate about, and it's a bit of a tricky one, because I would say, and this really great question to ask tonight, that particular community is one in which we need to use a community organising approach. So I think that pretty much every wildlife organisation, every conservation body, most governments, most people, to be fair, have done to farmers rather than worked with them. And realistically, I think that we would all possibly put in the same tough situation that many landowners and farmers are put in, might have to make the same very difficult and decisions. So I think we need to be working with landowners and actually understanding the challenges they're facing, and then figure out how to help them make a sustainable transition to an alternative model, because realistically there aren't that many examples of how you can move away from what has become quite a commodity-based kind of enterprise of maximising yields of, be it, I don't know, wheat, beef, lamb, whatever it might be. And we need to work with them to demonstrate how they can bring in other forms of income and how they can take a step back from having very high inputs, very high outputs and a very small profit margin, because it's very precarious And we really need to make sure that we're working with them to help them take the right steps, because I don't think without a huge amount of support that they can actually take that step as much as so many of them want to.
Perfect. I think we're slightly running over time. I've been given I think it's called a shepherd's crook from Debbie to kind of yank you away, Adam. However, I think we'll come back to some of these questions, because I think the whole point of having these types of sessions is for you, the membership, to engage with us. So we're making sure we're responding to you and responding to what's happening. So I think we'll come back. Jane, on your question around the trust involved with the British site in Torvain, yes, we've been very active there. It partly goes back to some of the earlier points around some of our relationships with some councils being more fruitful than others, but we can discuss that in more detail afterwards. Adam, do you want to introduce the next speaker?
I do indeed. And also just to say, for anyone who's put questions in the chat, I will be trying to answer them. I'll be replying to them as Rob and Andy are speaking, our next two speakers. And if you've got more questions, just keep them coming. And if you've got questions for Rob and Andy, please put those in the chat as well. I'll keep a record of them, and I'll ask Rob and Andy a couple of questions once both of them have done their talks, so I can hopefully recoup some of the time that I've taken up. I do apologise. So I'll be passing over to my colleague Rob Mcgee. So Rob is our Youth Engagement Officer with Stanford Nature Wales project, and he's been working with young people on pollinators in particular, so bees, butterflies and other invertebrates. And tonight he's going to talk to you about our Perfect Pollinators project. So Rob, over to you if that's okay.
Thank you, Adam. Thanks for the introduction. I'm just going to attempt to share my screen in the hope that this works. Okay.
Yeah, it's good.
Okay, so can you give me the thumbs up, or can you see that? Okay, so thank you, Adam. Yeah, so my name is Robert Mcgee. I'm the Youth Engagement Officer. And Adam, you've done me a favour actually, because you described the Stanford Nature Wales project quite well, but I'll just give a quick recap just to bring everyone up to speed. So the Stanford Nature Wales project is a youth-led, community-based climate action project covering all the Welsh wildlife trusts. In Gwent, there are 2 youth groups. I facilitate a group in the valleys. We have 12 people in our group between the age of 9 and 24. Predominantly from Blaenau Gwent, Torvain and parts of Caerphilly. They're called the Nature Nurturers. My colleague Petra Mitchard also leads a youth group based in Newport called the Wildlife Warriors. And together, with help from my colleagues Natalie Waller and Becky Williams, we have been empowering young people to use nature-based solutions to take action for climate change. One of the areas we've been looking at in particular is creating pollinator habitats and food supply, which is what I'm going to talk to you about in this presentation. So it all started last year, early 2021, with a resilient Greater Gwent project funded by Welsh Government called Perfect Pollinators. And the aim of the project was to create wildlife habitats in the form of bug hotels in community spaces and produce a web page with resources including how-to videos, pollinator identification guides, and advice on how to record sightings and take action at home. We delivered 2 activity days in June of last year, one at Mardy Park in Abergavenny with help of Growing Spaces and Wild Tots.
Oh, yeah.
Butterfly shelter, which is what you can see here just on the shed, and an interpretation board explaining details of how to identify different pollinators, butterflies, bees, beetles, and moths, but also how to help in your own garden, with a link to the SUBREC website as well. So it's really important to record sightings for conservation science. The other location that we put up a butterfly shelter was at Park and Bach, Tredegar, just here. And we did an activity day with local people there to help build the shelter and install it. It also has an interpretation board explaining how to help as well. Incidentally, it was Park and Bach that inspired us to do a butterfly shelter, because they said that they worried that people were afraid of bees. So the insect that pollinates the majority of our food crops and our trees that produce our oxygen. But incidentally, they attached bee homes to the side of the butterfly shelter, which have fallen apart. I'll come to that a little bit bit later. So later in the year, the youth group that I facilitate carried out extensive research into what works well and what doesn't when it comes to bug homes. And while multiplex bug homes like this one you can see on the top left look aesthetically pleasing, what we found is that research shows that butterflies, moths, beetles, bees living in one location is hopeful at best, and it doesn't really work like that in the wild. Also, these sort of upcycled plastic bug homes are not very good because the plastic attracts condensation, and the condensation then leads to mold and fungus, which are not good for invertebrates. So we did a lot of research, and we came up with some good designs that you can see here. This one is a block bee home with holes drilled into it. This one is the one we decided to create. This is a bee home with bamboo canes inside, square structure with an overhang roof, which is important so it didn't let rainwater in, and also using a joining plate to attach it to whatever structure we were attaching it to, rather than a piece of string like in this one, which can blow around in the wind. And yeah, so also looking at where to position them. So about 1.5 meters off the ground, south facing, so that it gets the most sun that it can during the winter, so it stays as warm as possible. And yeah, varying hole size is important as well, from 2 millimeters up to 10 millimeters. So in this one, you can see lots of different hole sizes to allow different sized bees to lay their eggs in it. Here's just some examples of bees that you can find using these homes, because not all bees use nest boxes, only solitary bees do, and they include mason bees. The top right here is a red mason bee. Mason bees seal their bamboo cane holes with mud and clay, which is what you can see here. And then you've got leafcutter bees, which, as the name suggests, they seal their entrance holes with leaves. This is a wood carving leafcutter bee, but the most common bee you're likely to see in your garden is a patchwork leafcutter. Excuse me a second. One of Britain's smallest bees, the harebell bee, this one in the bottom left, is absolutely tiny. In fact, its body width is only about 2 millimeters. So a solid block of wood with holes drilled, with 2 millimeter holes drilled into it is probably the best bee home that you can do for these. I think these are reed stems, which are much smaller than bamboo canes, which is why it's pictured there. The maintenance of bee homes is really important as well, because what you get, and as I discovered with my bee hotel at home, is that parasitic wasps love laying their eggs in them, and then when they hatch, they eat the eggs or the larvae of bees. So this is a ruby-tailed wasp checking out my bee hotel at home. So you need to clean your bee homes annually. You can check. The difficulty is knowing which holes have been successful and which haven't. So you can mark on the with a pen which bamboo canes have been used in the current year, and then you have to then clean it out the following year if it hasn't been successful. So having decided on the bee hotel design that they wanted to use, the nature nurturers went about creating them at the ERC. We put a few up around the ERC, and they also took some home with them. Even though the project is for 9 to 24-year-olds, our members encourage people of all ages to get involved, including this little baby in the corner over here, creating a little bee hotel there. But this particular design, I'm not only using within the youth group, I've taken it out to many community events and schools around Gwent, including the Blind of Gwent Play Team Wild Camp, which took place at Bedwellty House. So 15 young people made bee hotels to put up around their little sort of wild camp area at Bedwellty House. I've worked with the play team quite often actually, but so this is just one example of what I did with those. And at the Ebervale Institute, during their open week, I engaged with 12 young people making bee hotels for them to take home. So overall now, including the other events that I've done, there are around about 50 of these bee hotels around Gwent, each with the potential to house 50 to 80 bees' eggs. And every child took home with them an accompanying information sheet with all the sort of important information I've just explained now, so they can position them correctly and maintain them as well, which is really important. At this event, we also carried out a moth identification session in the morning, highlighting the importance of other pollinators as well, some of the sort of lesser known pollinators. And on the moth topic, we also took part in Moth Night. We're into 2022 now, this year, where 8 people from the local area identified moths that were caught in the moth trap set out the night before, where they learned moth identification techniques and the importance of recording their findings, not only in a book, but submitting the reporting to SUBREC so that we have a record for conservation science. Later, coming close to where we are this year now, we had a pollinator day during July. So we're into this financial year now, but we're kind of continuing the theme through. We again did a moths identification session in the morning. We took part in the big butterfly count, doing a butterfly transect in Central Valley Nature Reserve along this footpath here, submitting our records to the Butterfly Conservation Trust. And then in the afternoon, we also learned how to identify bees and beetles. All records were submitted to SUBREC and Butterfly Conservation Trust. Just a few more examples here of how the youth groups have been putting nature-based solutions to tackle climate change. So this is a beetle bank here at the Environmental Resource Centre in Evervale, creating a new habitat for beetles and bees. So that mound of earth we planted with 80% grass, 20% wildflower. So that'll create a new habitat and food supply for beetles and bees alike. The pond at the Environmental Resource Centre was a bit worse for wear. So we did some work to remove some of the pond weed, only a small amount, but created a bog garden around the edge just to create a new habitat and enhance the existing habitat. And also this is a green roof that we created at Eveswell Community Centre in Newport. So using nature-based solutions there to tackle climate change issues doesn't just help pollinators, but it's to help all wildlife and people too. And that's my talk. So diolch yn fawr, thank you very much. Sorry if that was fast, but I was given quite a small time slot. So thank you for listening.
That was brilliant, Rob. Thank you very much. Has anyone got any... Oh, no, I'm not asking for questions yet. Sorry, I forgot. Sorry, I will be going straight on to Andy, and then I'll come back for questions for both Rob and Andy. So please have a think about questions for Rob over the next 5 or 10 minutes. And I'm hoping Andy's somewhere in the room. I haven't seen his beaming smile, but I'm sure he is.
I'm here.
Oh, good stuff. There he is. So Andy Karran is our evidence manager, and he'll present next on several of our invertebrate projects that we've been working on over the last year or so, or that we're currently completing. So without further ado, Andy, take it away.
Right, Joe, thank you, Adam. Yes, I'm going to whisk through these quickly and get us back on time, kind of. But yeah, so over the last few years and currently ongoing, we're doing various invertebrate projects. So I'm going to quickly whiz through a few of them. There's the bugs matter, there's shrill carder bees, there's saproxylic invertebrates, I said that right, at Deersfield, orchard invertebrates on the Gwent levels, eDNA on the Gwent levels, and hornet robberflies and large scabies bees at Rockwell Meadows. So first of all, there's bugs matter. I hope various people have been taking part in this. This is a citizen science thing, which we've been undertaking. We did it last year and we've been doing it again this year, but it was originally undertaken 20 years ago. And you've probably all noticed when you're sort of driving along, years ago, you'd see a lot more insects in your headlights, lots more insects splattered on your windscreen. And obviously everyone says there's less now, but is there really less now? So we needed some real proper scientific evidence to back this up. So I said, this survey that was done 20 years ago, we repeated in 2021. And basically I should explain exactly how you do it. Basically, you get the app on your phone and you go out. Every time you do a car journey, you put in when you start, and then you hit the thing when you finish. And then when you get out, you count all the splattered bugs on your license plate. Then you clean it, then you do another journey, and it all gets submitted. The results are basically, in the last 20 years, there's been a 58% reduction in the number of insects in UK as a whole. And we're not quite so bad in Gwent, but it's still a 40% reduction, which is, you know, dreadful. And if there's less insects, there's less of all the other wildlife that feeds upon them. So I said we repeated this again in 2022. We haven't quite got results yet from this year, but when we do, I'm sure we'll be publishing that in the next Wild About Gwent. Next one is a shrill card bee. This is the rarest bumblebee species in the UK, but we're very lucky here in Gwent to have quite a decent population on the Gwent levels. Another sort of illustration of just why the Gwent levels is such an important habitat, and we've got particularly good populations at Great Traston Meadows. So we were out with Bumblebee Conservation Trust early on this year, and they're going to be putting together part of Natcha and Bith. There'll be a shrill card bee project, which we are hoping to be involved with them. And obviously our long-term goal, and I think we said earlier, one of our 10 species we're going to improve the fortunes of by 2030 is the shrill card bee. So we want to improve their fortunes on our reserves, but also on other sites across the Gwent levels. The next one is saproxylic invertebrates. These are insects that rely on dead wood. So we've got lots of different longhorn beetles here. And Piercefield Woods, which is one of our reserves down by Chepstow, is actually ranked as the second best site in Wales for these. And it's home to species such as Cosnard's leaf beetle. That's only Welsh site. So we've been collecting samples last year and again this year, and they're sent off to an expert down in Cornwall who identifies them for us. And then obviously if we know what species are there, we can do the correct actions to improve their fortunes. And then this is sort of quite interesting stuff we've been doing this year. I say quite, it's very interesting stuff. I shouldn't underplay it. This is eDNA, environmental DNA. So this is all sort of cutting edge stuff in ecological survey work. Hopefully it's not going to put myself and colleagues out of a job, because basically we just go and collect water samples from reens down on the Gwent levels, and we push them through a filter and we send the filters off. And we only got the results back last week, so I can't really say much about these yet, but basically we surveyed 10 reens down on Bridewell Common and on Megan Marsh, and we got our results back, and there was 194 different taxa were detected. It would appear to included some species which are new for Wales and possibly new for the UK. So there's these things which are really difficult to record unless you're a real expert and you have to look down a microscope, but just collecting water samples and sending them off and identifying by the DNA. So hopefully this can be a way forward to get more cost effective and sort of more widespread surveying down on the levels, and again sort of identify their value even further. And then again down on the Gwent levels, there's lots of orchards on the levels, traditional orchards, but the numbers have fallen hugely, and there's maybe only 200 orchards left. I think that's right, perhaps even less. But over 3 years, we commissioned an expert entomologist, Paul Whitehead, to go and do surveys in some of these orchards. And it was amazing what was found. 172 different families of insects recorded, 84 different species of conservation concern, 6 species new to Wales. He also did work on the driftwood on the foreshore, and this all basically demonstrated just how valuable these orchards are, and sort of reinforced sort of our work, which we've been undertaking to sort of preserve and increase the orchard coverage on the levels. And finally, this is Rockwell Meadows, which is one of our nature reserves. We have been managing this reserve for the hornet robber fly, which is the UK's biggest fly, and we've had to manage it for that because it's a reason for the triple-side designation. That it's a bit unpleasant, but that the young of the hornet robber fly like to live in cow dung. So to do this, we've had to put cattle grazing on quite early in the summer to make sure there's cattle dung there for them. Then we've discovered that there's an even rarer insect there, the large Scabies Bee. which requires, as its name would imply, scabious flowers to feed on, and it needs these scabious flowers late in the summer. So an early cut and put all cattle grazing on doesn't help with having lots of scabious flowers later on in the summer. So it's just an example of some of the challenges we face in our reserves to try and balance the management of different sort of protected species. So at the moment we're chatting to bug life, and we're going to alter our management slightly down there, and hopefully we can make it a haven for both these species. I think that's me done. Thank you.
That was fantastic. Thank you, Andy. That's brilliant. I've got a question for Rob on the chat, and just wondered if anyone else wants to either type a question in there or put their hand up, then I can come to you and see what your question's about. But I have to limit it to a couple of questions at most for each, because we're going to have to let our keynote speaker, Dave Goulson, come on in a moment or two. Rob, just start with you. Someone, Jay Way, has come back and said, does GWT have an online information hub for members of the public to ask questions about, for example, doing projects on their land, or land management, so preparing land for meadow or pollinator beds, ponds for wildlife, etc.?
So there is a web page, there's a Stand for Nature web page, which has a web form on it, so you can get in touch with us via that. Now, obviously, because this project is relatively specific, i.e. it has certain goals to achieve, depending on what you wanted. So basically, if it's a community-based climate action project where our youth group can get involved, then the answer would probably be yes. However, because this is a youth-led project, I am just facilitator, and actually it is led by them. So they make the decisions and I help them. So I would, if the best thing to do would be to contact me on the webpage, which is gwentwildlife.org/Stand for Nature Wales. You can either do it that way, or you can go via Get Involved Young People, and then that brings up the Stand for Nature Wales webpage, and there's a web form there. I can get in touch with you that way, and we can discuss what projects you've got in mind.
That's brilliant. Thanks, Rob. And also we do have things like the GWT wildlife spotting Facebook group. So there are kind of other ways where if you've got questions about either species or sometimes about the management, then you can post them on there, and often people will get involved. And others like the Monmouthshire Rewilding groups, Cherry Taylor runs that, and they're a great font of knowledge, as well as the Monmouthshire Meadows group, etc. So we're lucky to have a lot of very good, and knowledgeable naturalists across Gwent. I cannot believe that no one's got a question for Andy, apart from being blown away by the sheer range and diversity of invertebrate stuff that's being done. No one has a question about, flies living or completing their life cycle in cow dung, or eDNA in reens on the levels. Come on, someone must have a question.
I'm happy with that.
All right. I was going to say you've stunned them into silence, Andy. So obviously, don't feel pressured to ask your question right now. I'm still, believe it or not, I am still working through the questions on the chat. So I'm trying to both compare and answer your questions. So I will get to them. I will answer all of your questions, I promise. And it may just be worth scrolling up and down to make sure that you can find my response to your question, because it may be some distance away from your question, but I will answer it, I promise. That's kind of us, and I just want to firstly, before we get on to Professor Dave Goulson and our kind of main talk of the night, I wanted to say thank you to all of you for your support, but also a huge thanks to all of my colleagues, our volunteers and others. In particular, thank you very much to Rob and Andy for speaking tonight. Thank you very much for Mark for chairing. Thank you very much for Alison as chair throughout quite a lot of the last year. Yes, so I think a huge amount of thanks to go around to all of my colleagues for their fantastic work day in and day out, and to all of our volunteers for turning up every week and whatever the weather to save wildlife. So without further ado, and hoping that he's in the room somewhere and I haven't seen him yet, I'll introduce our keynote speaker, Professor Dave Goulson. So Dave is the Professor of Biology at University of Sussex, founder of Bumblebee Conservation Trust and a Wildlife Trust ambassador. UK's leading expert on insects with a focus on bumblebees, accomplished author, shortlisted for the Samuel Johnson Prize in 2013, and acclaimed for The Garden Jungle and A Sting in the Tail. And in 2021, he published Silent Earth, Averting the Insect Apocalypse. Wowzers, I'd love to have an introduction that long and impressive. So Dave, I'm hoping you're here somewhere and that you're going to take the stage.
Yeah.
Brilliant.
Hi, thanks Adam. Yes, I'm here. I hope you can hear me. And I hope the, oh yeah, there we go. Just bear with me while I share my screen. Okay, and then hopefully if I press that button, there we go, lovely. Thanks very much for the introduction. Thank you everyone for tuning in this evening to listen to that. I enjoyed the previous two talks. It's really exciting. There's so much happening in the world of insect conservation. A few decades ago, nobody really bothered much about conserving insects. The focus was all on bigger things with fur and feathers. But thankfully, the world is slowly changing, and there's definitely more appreciation for insects. I've been kind of obsessed by insects since I was a little kid. I used to collect caterpillars and grasshoppers and anything I could find when I was only 5 or 6 years old, and keep them in jam jars and pots and all sorts of things. Most of them died, to be fair, but I found out a lot about them in the process. I guess lots of people do have a bug phase when they're little, but it always saddens me that most adults and teenagers too, they don't like insects. They're frightened of them. They even the names bugs, creepy crawlies don't really do them any favors. And given topically, since I'm talking to people in Gwent, this kind of for me epitomizes the problem we face. So I didn't see this sign myself. I found it on Twitter the other day. Someone had posted it. You'll notice in the small letters at the top of that sign, University of South Wales. I'm not sure where exactly this was. Anyway, warning, flying insects in this area. What kind of message does that send out to kids? It's kind of saying, insects are terrifying things that you should run away from or something. Turns out actually they were warning about some flying ants, but why create a big sign to tell people? Flying ants are completely hard. Anyway, sorry, I could rant on. From my perspective, insects are amazing creatures. They're incredibly diverse. Just a few kind of insect facts. They've been around 480 million years, about twice as long as the dinosaurs. There are 1.1 million known species. And an estimated 3 or 4 or 5 million more awaiting discovery. We just don't know, which is mind-boggling, really, isn't it? They were the first creatures to sing on our planet, very likely, and certainly the first creatures to fly. And they've diversified into this amazing array of forms and all these different species with weird behaviors and life cycles and so on. And sadly, as I think everybody here will now know, these creatures are in decline. Now, I don't want to spend too long on this. I could show you lots of graphs, and I could show you the statistics for British butterflies, which have declined about 50% overall since 1976, or the German data that some of you will have seen before, showing flying insect biomass in Germany fell 76% in 26 years, and so on and so on. I'm just going to give you one example, which again is relevant to you guys. This shrill carder bumblebee, which we were just hearing about. A lovely little bee, one of my absolute favorites, and it used to be quite common. If you look at that distribution map pre-1960, it was found all over the southern half of Britain and quite abundant in the south. But sadly, as time went on, it became less so. So by 1980, it was pretty scarce. By 2000, it was down to about 6 or 7 sites in southern Britain. And that's about when I started getting interested in rare bees and what was happening with them. the time I was based at the University of Southampton, and I wanted to find out more about these bees and, you know, try and work out what we could do to conserve them. So I spent a summer looking for them on Salisbury Plain, which, if you can see my mouse, is obviously that little cluster of red dots there in the middle. And I did find some, but I spent the whole summer there, and I think I saw 4 shrill carders, which was slightly frustrating. And actually that population on Salisbury Plain has gone extinct since I saw them there. So then we're down to well, whatever, about 4 or 5 populations. The one on the Somerset Levels is very, very weak now. There are still a few left on the last count, but serious cause for concern that population might be gone soon. So this bee is disappearing, you know, on our watch, in our lifetimes. It could go extinct in Britain within a few years if we don't look out for it, which again it emphasizes why places like the Gwent Levels are so important. That's one of the last few of very few strongholds for this declining bee, and we really need to make sure it hangs on in there. Anyway, so I think it's important to bear in mind why we need insects, why these insect declines should concern us. This is probably fairly familiar territory to most people, but I think it's important, so bear with me. So I mentioned insects they make up the bulk of life on Earth in terms of numbers of species. More than something like 70% of known species are insects, so they are biodiversity. But they're also that a lot of other biodiversity depends on them. The things that aren't insects, like birds and bats and frogs and toads and newts and lizards and so on, they all eat insects. So if the insects go, obviously these larger creatures, which more people tend to care about, are going to be in trouble. Insects do lots of other stuff too, of course. They kind of make ecosystems work. If you took the insects out, everything would grind to a halt. They recycle dung and dead bodies and dead trees and leaves, and they keep the soil healthy, and they help to control pests, and they distribute seeds and so on. And most of this, no one pays a blind bit of notice to, and I guess most humans are completely oblivious to these processes going on. The one thing that I think the majority of people are now aware of is that insects pollinate, and that's important. There's a lot of misconceptions about exactly who's doing the pollinating and so on. Some people seem to think that honeybees pollinate everything, which is a long, long way from the truth. Just in the UK, there was a recent estimate that suggested that there are about 6,000 species of insect that pollinate in the UK. So there's butterflies and moths and lots of species of flies and beetles and wasps and so on, as well as our 270-ish species of bee, all busy visiting flowers and making sure those flowers set seed and continue to exist. They wouldn't if they weren't pollinated. And globally, it's about 80% of all plant species on our planet depend on insect pollination, including, of course, many of our crops. About 75% of crop species varieties grown in the world rely on insect pollination to give a good yield. So if we were to lose our insect pollinators, then this amazing array of fruits and vegetables that we see in every supermarket simply wouldn't be there. Many of them would be gone or would be much more scarce. Everything from apples and cherries and tomatoes, strawberries, raspberries, chili peppers, even coffee and chocolate depend on insect pollinators. So you know, the harsh truth is people would starve if we didn't have these insects. We need to make sure we don't end up like these people, hand pollinating their flowers in southwest China because there aren't enough bees left to do it. It's just about economic in that part of the world for people to do the jobs of bees. But it's hard to imagine that being a viable option for most crops in Europe. And just imagine a farmer with his paintbrush trying to pollinate a field of oilseed rape. It's not going to work, I don't think. So we need to look after them. And I've trotted out this argument hundreds of times, the importance of insects. But actually, in recent years, I've started to wonder whether it is actually the best argument to be using, for two reasons, really. One is that it's not really why I care about insects. I don't think it's a shame the shrill-carder might go extinct because I'm worried that I won't have apples to eat. I'm worried because I think it's beautiful and interesting and fascinating, along with all these other insects, and I think they deserve their place on the planet, regardless of whether they do something for us. It seems really quite sort of shallow and selfish to only value things that provide some kind of service to humans. And actually, there are probably loads and loads of insects that don't do anything useful from our perspective. Maybe they don't do much at all, but does that mean they don't deserve to exist, that we can wipe them out? So here's just a random example. This is the St. Helena giant earwig, which was the biggest earwig that ever lived that we know of, bigger than any surviving species. Sadly, it's extinct. It hasn't been seen since, I think, 1967. It's almost certainly gone. About 3 inches long, these beasts were. Fantastic. I'd have loved to have seen one, although, to be fair, I probably would never have gone to St. Helena just to see an earwig. But anyway, even though none of us would probably have ever seen one, and this thing went extinct without any seeming consequences, it wasn't doing something that vital that needed doing, so far as we can tell. But it seems to me the world is a poorer place because it doesn't have a giant earwig, regardless of whether any of us were going to see it or whether it did anything useful. And likewise, millions of other species. Surely they're all our sort of fellow travelers on this planet hurtling through space. I think they deserve a place as much as we do, I would argue. Perhaps I'm mad. Anyway, so insects are in trouble. They're important. They deserve to live, in my view, one way or another. How do we look after them? This is the key thing. What can we do to turn around these declines and make sure that our children inherit a world full of buzzing bees and flapping butterflies and everything? I want to talk briefly about 3 different areas, which there they are: farming, rewilding, and what we can do in urban areas, which I've called urban rewilding. These are all huge topics, and I've only got a half hour in total, so I'm going to have to very superficially skim through them, particularly the first one, which is actually the biggest one, really. And I think, arguably, the biggest question facing, the biggest challenge facing humanity in the next few decades is this one. How do we feed everybody without destroying our planet, which at the moment is what we're doing. We're farming an ever bigger area, ever more intensively, with more and more chemical inputs, fertilizers and pesticides and so on, with terrible cost to the environment, but it's done in the name of making sure everyone gets fed. Actually, I think this is personally think this is a dead-end route to farming, that it's not sustainable, very simply. And very briefly, and forgive this really superficial sort of coverage of a complicated topic, but broadly, there are at least 3 reasons why we can't carry on the way we have been farming, sort of exemplified by these 3 pictures. So top left, it's the biggest driver of biodiversity loss globally. It's why we have a biodiversity crisis, largely. The ever-extending monocultures of things like oil palm and soybean, and closer to home, wheat and so on. It's undermining its own basis because farming needs pollinators, it needs natural enemies to help control pests and so on. So it's wiping out biodiversity. It's also doing terrible damage to soils. About 40% of the world's soils are already degraded, according to the United Nations. And food production in its entirety contributes something like 35–40% of our greenhouse gas emissions, which also has to stop. So we can't carry on doing what we have been doing. So what should we do instead? Well, whatever we do, I think it's maybe useful to think, what do we want from farming? What are the essential kind of criteria for a sustainable farming system. It obviously needs to look after the soil, because future generations, I'm pretty sure, are going to need soil to grow their crops in. So it's really fundamental that we don't continue damaging soils as we have. I think we need to find a way to farm with nature rather than trying to control and kill everything. We need those pollinators, we need those natural enemies of crop pests, we need the recyclers and all the other creatures that make ecosystems work. Which basically means we need to massively reduce pesticide inputs, or ideally get rid of them entirely, which might sound dramatic. If I had more time, I could explain why I think that's viable. And of course, we need to grow enough food, and ideally, actually, we need to grow different food, because at the moment we overproduce food that's unhealthy, grains and oils, and meat, and we underproduce the fruits and vegetables that actually we don't eat enough of. There aren't enough fruits and vegetables grown in the world to feed the human population a healthy diet, sadly. So we need to grow different stuff and a greater diversity of stuff, I think. There are some really interesting things happening in this field, and you've probably all got your own ideas as to how we can make farming more sustainable. I've visited examples of all of these types of farms, and I think they all have something to offer. There's some, as I say, really exciting stuff going on. Agroforestry involves using perennial crops to hold the soil together, interspersed with annual crops. Biodynamic farming sometimes seems slightly wacky, but I visit quite often a local biodynamic farm, and it's teeming with wildlife, and they produce loads of food, and the soil is black and healthy. They're doing something right, and I think that it's perfectly possible to feed the world in a truly sustainable way by working with nature. We just need to invest more in this kind of farming and developing it, and less. An interesting fact I saw recently was that these kinds of alternative types of approaches to farming have had about 2% of research and development spend of the total budget spent on farming. 98% goes into ever more intensive farming, essentially. Anyway, I better park farming there, and it's really needs a whole talk just on this subject, and I'm probably not the best person to give it. The second thing I wanted to talk about is related. It's rewilding, which has become really a hot topic, a controversial topic. It really turns some people's noses up. I personally am a fan, and I want to try and explain why I think we should be doing more rewilding. Not everywhere. We obviously need to feed everybody, but I think there's definitely a place for it in the mix. Not least because conventional conservation hasn't succeeded. We can't do it on a big enough scale at the moment. So what is rewilding? My first experience of rewilding was reading and hearing about Yellowstone, which is this huge national park. You may be familiar with the story. You may have heard George Monbiot talking about this. He made a short film. Basically, it's a huge area of land, and it was a few decades ago, it was completely overrun with what they call elk, which are basically red deer. It was terribly overgrazed. The trees couldn't regenerate. There was soil erosion because there wasn't much vegetation left. The ecosystem was badly damaged, and the decision was taken to reintroduce wolves that had been hunted out centuries earlier. And the story goes that these wolves had a really profound positive effect on the ecosystem. There were only a few dozen wolves, but they changed the behavior of the elk. They made the elk nervous. They made them want to stay out in open spaces. They avoided particularly steep-sided rivers because the wolves could trap them. And that meant that trees started to regenerate along the riverbanks, which provided more food for beavers, and the beaver population rose, and they created more dams, which provided more wildlife habitat. And there's a lot more to the whole story, but basically there was this cascade of benefits from restoring a top predator to the ecosystem, which all sounds kind of cool to me. From a UK perspective, things are a bit different. Not entirely different, but we have a small country, and we probably can't introduce wolves. But there's a really interesting thing. When I was at university, the prevailing view of Europe was that historically, before people came along, it was pretty much dense forest from the Mediterranean to the far north. And that was kind of backed up by the fact that if you leave a piece of land in Britain, for example, for 100 years, it will turn into a forest. That seems to be the natural state of things. But it always puzzled me and many other people, because it begs the question, where did all the sun-loving grassland species live in this world if it was all densely forested? It didn't kind of make much sense. Loads of British species wouldn't thrive in a dense woodland or even close. So how do we explain their existence here? The explanation, I think, is that it wasn't dense forest. It was a much more open habitat, maintained by the presence of large herbivores. If you go back only 115,000 years, there were elephants wandering around Britain. More recently, giant aurochs, the ancestors of the cows, ponies, deer, wild pigs, and so on, all these large mammals that we've lost. And so rewilding in Britain is more about restoring the large herbivores to provide the disturbance and the grazing, to prevent this succession to dense forest, and provide habitats for more wildlife. The project I know best is the Knepp estate, which is pretty well known. It's a bit of a trip from Gwent, but it's probably doable in a day if you get up early. It's a fantastic place. I don't have shares in their business or whatever. It was a 3,500 acre farmed estate, very intensively managed farmland with very little wildlife until 20 years ago. But it's on a pretty poor soil. The crop yields were low. It was really hard, despite huge subsidies they received. They were running at a small loss, and they took the decision to instead of farming it, to rewild it. They introduced a substitute for the auroch, some tough longhorn cattle, Exmoor ponies, Tamworth pigs to substitute for the wild boars. They put in some red deer. More recently, they've introduced storks and beavers, which is really exciting. And I think it's working. If I defy anyone to go there, go in June if you get the chance, and go for a walk through this kind of interesting scrubby mosaic of habitats that has sprung up in what was once the most boring farmers' fields of wheat and maize and so on. And you'll hear loads of nightingales. Their nightingale populations are absolutely tanking in the UK, particularly lowland England. Likewise, cuckoos have become very scarce. I never hear cuckoos apart from at Knepp these days. Turtle doves have more or less disappeared from the landscape in lowland Britain, close to extinction here, but there's several pairs nesting at Knepp. So you can walk around and you can hear the nightingales and the cuckoos and the purring of the turtle doves. And if you're lucky, you might see purple emperor butterflies. They have the biggest population in the UK there, and they didn't have any purple emperor butterflies when they started. This year they saw large tortoiseshells. Where they came from is unclear, but they were thought to be extinct in Britain. Suddenly they've miraculously popped up at Knepp. So I think it's personally it's brilliant, and I think there's space for more rewilding projects on the least productive land, on land like Knepp, and perhaps some of the uplands of Britain, which rely very heavily on subsidies. Farming wouldn't be viable otherwise, and they don't produce a great deal of food. They could, I think, be better served providing tourism opportunities, biodiversity, and carbon capture instead. That's my view. Not everyone agrees, I know. Okay. Third and finally, how are we doing for time? Yeah, not too. I started late. I'll try and keep roughly to my half an hour, but I might go over a tiny bit. The third thing, which closer to home, sadly, I don't have 3,500 acres to rewild. I wish I did. Wouldn't that be fun? But anyway, I don't. What I do have is a garden, and many of us have gardens. And I think there's some really exciting opportunities that everyone can get involved in here, in terms of inviting more nature in to live in our urban areas. You don't even need a garden to get involved. and this is something that's I think it's really captured the public's imagination. There are loads of people all around Britain planting wildflowers in their gardens, planting bee-friendly flowers, doing what they can to encourage nature. And just imagine if you know, we have I think it's something like 22 million private gardens in the UK. They cover an estimated area of, it's about 1 million acres, 400,000 hectares of land, which is more than our nature reserves, not more than our national parks, as Megan McCubin said the other day. But anyway, that's the distraction. But more than our nature reserves. It's a huge area. And if supposing that was all wildlife friendly, and on top of that, we could get the councils on board so that the road verges were full of flowers, the roundabouts, the city parks, the cemeteries, then that would be a national network of nature friendly habitat. And that would really, I think, make a difference. So there's an exciting movement towards kind of making our gardens a bit wilder and more biodiverse, which is brilliant. But at the same time, sadly, there are people doing this kind of hideous thing. There's a big boom in plastic grass sales these days. You can even, I saw this the other day, a plastic hedge. Who needs to worry about box moth when if you just put in a plastic box hedge? Nothing to worry about. You can even get plastic wisteria to pin to your house, flower for 12 months of the year. What's not to love? I find it terribly depressing, and I wish we could make this socially unacceptable. This idea that the garden should be just some sort of sterile place made of plastic with no maintenance at all. Seems terribly sad to me. And I think a lot of people don't really think about this, but gardening, as we'll see, can be really amazing for wildlife, or gardens can be, or they can be awful like these. And actually a lot of the gardening industry is not very environmentally friendly. You know, if your idea of gardening, or forget the plastic grass extremes, but if your idea of gardening is to drive to a big out-of-town garden centre at the weekend and fill a trolley with some bedding plants grown in and sold in disposable plastic pots, probably grown in a peat-based compost, probably treated with pesticides and fertilizers, and get a sack of fertilizer, a sack of peat-based compost, some bug clear, some herbicide, some Roundup or whatever, and wheel it all to the checkout. You can see where I'm going. This is not environmentally friendly at all. But on the other hand, managed more gently, gardens can teem with life. And there's this fantastic example from Leicester. There was a lady called Jenny Owen who had a little urban garden, 1/8 of an acre of garden, close to the city centre in Leicester, which is not a city famed for biodiversity. And she spent 35 years cataloguing every species of plant and animal, including the tiniest insects and spiders and so on, in her garden, 35 years. And at the end of it, her species list was 2,673, which I think is just mind-boggling. You know, I wouldn't have thought a rainforest, 1/8 of an acre of rainforest would have that many species, let alone a garden in Leicester. So it just goes to show, you know, we can have thousands of species in our gardens and our city parks and so on. So how do we do that? How do we encourage as many species as possible? Again, I haven't really got time for anything more than a pretty superficial skim through. A few pointers though. There's lots of evidence that native plants are best. They are, on average, slightly better at attracting pollinating insects. This is one paper based on some work that I did, that's at the bottom there, which is an open access paper, which anyone can look at if you want to know more. Basically, I did working with Rosie Rowlings, who had a nursery in Oxfordshire at the time. She ran this big trial of, I think it was 111 different plants, species and varieties and cultivars, and recorded how many insects visited them. And cut a long story short, when we analysed her data, we found that the native plants do better on average, although there are some non-natives that attract loads of pollinators. So there's a few of the best native plants for pollinators: Viper's bugloss, wonderful, marjoram, greater knapweed, and so on. But actually, pollinators aren't that fussy. They'll happily visit plants from America or China or wherever. The insects that are really fussy are the herbivores, the caterpillars, the shield bugs. There are thousands of species of herbivorous insect that eat the tissues, the leaves, and so on of plants. And they tend to be much fussier than insects that just drink the nectar. Because nectar is just sugary water for whatever flower it comes from, whereas the leaves of plants tend to be loaded with toxins intended to stop herbivores from eating them. And the only way and so insects have evolved to overcome the defenses of certain plant species, and they specialize in eating them. So, for example, very familiar butterfly, the orange tip, it'll only lay its eggs on lady's smock and garlic mustard, because they're the only plants its caterpillars can eat. And if you grow those plants in your garden, there's a really good chance you'll get a breeding population of orange tips in your garden. If you don't grow those plants, you won't have breeding orange tips. You can't. And similarly, every native plant supports several, sometimes dozens, even hundreds in some cases, of herbivorous insects. Take an extreme example: grow a eucalyptus tree from Australia in your garden, it will support pretty much nothing. Grow an oak tree and hundreds of species of insect can feed on it. So native plants are good. Which brings me to the slightly thorny subject of weeds. Many of us were taught from an early age there are certain sort of plants you shouldn't have in your garden. You're a bad gardener if you have dandelions in your lawn or whatever. These are native wildflowers. And they're all native wildflowers that are really attractive to pollinators. And I think we should try to be more tolerant. This is maybe a bit silly, but you can get rid of all the weeds in your garden just like that, just by calling them all wildflowers, because that's basically what they are. I won't dwell on this, but mow less. Very simple. Leave the mower in the shed as much as possible and your lawn will probably burst into flower. That's my lawn. Make yourself a gin and tonic instead of pushing the mower around. It's a much more productive way to spend your day. Of course, it isn't just gardens that have lots of mown areas. Road verges, roundabouts, parks are often mown 8 times a year by the local council. They often don't need to be. They could instead, like this one, be full of wildflowers. And just imagine if every road verge and every roundabout was planted up with wildflowers like that. Wouldn't that be nice? Instead, what we often see is this kind of horror. This you'll probably recognize on the left there, that bit of dead grass around a silver birch. It's been sprayed with Roundup, which is the herbicide of choice almost invariably these days. Many councils employ teams of people to drive around looking for anything green and killing it with herbicide. They spray park paths, children's play areas, and so on, with a chemical, Roundup. The active ingredient is glyphosate, that is a probable carcinogen according to the World Health Organization, and we're spraying it in our streets. It just seems completely nuts to me, and also just entirely unnecessary. What harm was that little bit of vegetation doing? I personally think we should ban pesticides for urban use, as France did in 2018. You can't buy pesticides essentially in France these days unless you're a farmer. And Paris is still standing. It hasn't been overrun with giant cockroaches or whatever. If it's good enough for France, I'm sure, obviously this is not an argument that would wash with the UK government that wants to do the opposite of whatever Europe does. But anyway, we just you do not need any of these chemicals in your garden. I promise you, I garden organically and I manage perfectly well without any of them. Beware also, I guess many of you probably do garden organically or wouldn't at least spray an insecticide in your garden, but you should beware that if you buy these beautiful plants from the local garden centre, sadly they've almost certainly been treated with pesticides. We published a paper in 2017 where we bought plants from all the big name garden centres, and we specifically bought ones that were labelled as bee friendly or pollinator friendly. We tested them for pesticides, and basically 98% of them contained pesticides. Many of them contain really potent insecticides called neonicotinoids. And they're being sold as bee friendly, which is kind of ironic and sad, and probably ought to be illegal, really. Surely that breaks trades descriptions rules. So much better to grow from seed or find an organic nursery like Rosie Rowland's nursery, in fact. Just to kind of wrap up, maybe we need to rewild ourselves a bit. It would be nice if we could certainly learn to be less tidy-minded in our gardening, in our farming. If we could resist this urge to kill anything that's slightly inconvenient to us, and ideally learn to respect and love nature. You know, our ancestors used to think there were spirits living in every stream and every tree and so on, and we've moved away from that to a kind of religion where in the Bible it basically says that man is made in the image of God and is the most important thing on earth, and the beasts and the birds were created just for us to use and abuse as we like, which is an awful view of the world, I think. Sorry if I'm having a go at Christianity here. Anyway, I think we need to respect the rest of the life on our planet, whatever it does. You know, as I mentioned earlier, we live on this rock. It's extraordinary. It's our home. It is everything we have. Whatever Elon Musk says, we're not going to be whizzing off to live on Mars anytime soon. And it's a rock hurtling through space with this little crust of life clinging to its surface, mostly different types of insect and us. And it's amazing. It's inspiring, and it's a source of wonder, and of course it's our home, and it provides us with our food and everything else that we have. So why are we being so ridiculously reckless with it? We can do better, and what better place to start than by looking after all the little insects that live in our gardens. Okay, thank you very much for listening to me.
Thank you very much, Dave. That was absolutely fantastic. Really appreciate it. I'm sure we're going to have lots of questions, so I will ask for people to put questions in the chat, or they can stick their hands up if they would like to ask Dave the question themselves. I will start with my own question, if you don't mind. I'll use the kind of chair's privilege and just say, Dave, in terms of the contribution towards the farming debate, where do you sit, or how much of a role do you think that insects have to play in approaches like integrated pest management? So actually, obviously, using beneficial insects to, you know, to deal with many of the pests that you sometimes get on monoculture crops.
Yeah, absolutely. I think this is really important. I mean, in a micro scale, if you grow fruits and vegetables in a garden, it's really easy. You don't need pesticides because the predatory insects do the job for you. They keep everything under control. In a big monoculture farming, that doesn't work so well, because it's very difficult to maintain big populations of those predatory insects, because there's nowhere for them to live when the crop is harvested. And so that's a real challenge, and one of the reasons why I personally think that large scale monocultures are not the way forward. You know, there's a field 200 yards away from where I sit, which is about 60 hectares. It's massive, and there's no way you can ever really, I think, encourage enough predators to properly control crop pests if you grow fields of such scale. But if you divide them up with strips of trees or hedges and make the field smaller again, then it is possible. And there was a really interesting recent study, a big farm trial, where they set aside more land. I think it was 8% or 10% of the farm was set aside for nature. And the overall yield after a couple of years didn't drop at all, because there were more pollinators, there were more predatory insects. So the remaining, and of course, the land that was set aside was the least productive land. You don't take out your most fertile soils. You set aside the damp corners or whatever that aren't much good for growing crops anyway, but they're great for insects. And overall, you produce just as much food while creating space for nature. So, you know, it's not actually, I don't think, that difficult to farm, to encourage biodiversity and produce food. But we've gone sort of, I think, partly perhaps marketing by the companies that make these chemicals. They've persuaded farmers to become very reliant on pesticides as their go-to solution to all problems, which is a real shame.
I agree, and it's interesting you say about that example, because I remember another paper which was around the installation of bird nest boxes in orchards, and how, you know, by having a loss of fruit to many, I think it was caterpillars, beetles, and other invertebrates, just by having nest boxes and having mainly blue tits and great tits nesting in the orchard, they managed to significantly increase not only the populations of birds, they managed to increase the diversity of invertebrates, because it meant that there wasn't kind of any particular species becoming dominant, and the crop yield went up dramatically. So it's really nice to see that there are ways that you can kind of get these multiple benefits. You know, it's not a case of you have to, as you say, sacrifice your crop or your yield or your income in order to get more biodiversity. You can actually have your apple and eat it, so to speak. I'm gonna, 1 second. Oh, here we go. Right, so our chair, Mark, has asked the question. Here you go, Dave. What 2 or 3 things could we as a wildlife trust do that would make the greatest difference?
That's quite a tricky one, isn't it? I mean,
we only ask you the tricky questions.
Sorry to plug my own book, but in Silent Earth, the final quarter of it is all about things we can do. And there are hundreds of things in there. It's divided up into things farmers can do, things gardeners can do, things politicians could do. So it's very hard to pick 2 or 3, because actually it would be great if people did all of them, or as many as they possibly can, because we need to pull out all the stops if we're going to turn around this environmental crisis that we have. But so what can I guess the biggest win, if we could achieve it, is trying to influence farming policy. And I don't know much about exactly what's happening in Wales at the moment, but in England, it's all still feels very much up in the air. You know, when Michael Gove was Environment Minister 3 or 4 years ago, he made a lot of really good noises and set in process what seemed to be a really promising idea of moving towards the whole subsidy system being redirected towards supporting properly sustainable farming. But then it's got watered down over time, and the current government seem to have a rather different view. And I'm really worried that it's going to all just evaporate. So if the Wildlife Trust could really, I don't know how much sway you have with, you know, but that 70% of Britain is farmland. So if that remains mostly quite hostile to life, which it is, it's going to be really difficult to turn around the biodiversity crisis. So that, I guess, is where I might suggest you put most effort.
That's brilliant. It's really interesting, because you actually answered exactly the question I was going to ask as a follow-up, which is, when I talk to people, some people kind of suggest starting very much at kind of grassroots and saying, right, we'll get lots of people to take some action. I think you're saying we can kind of, you know, tackle it at both ends. You know, we need to be talking about policy. We need to be, you know, because turning that dial even a very small, you know, to a very small degree will have a significant impact. But equally, at the other end, people in their gardens need to be doing their bit for wildlife, and hopefully together those 2 things will solve many of the problems. Just as a explainer for everyone in the room, so the sustainable farming scheme, which is just coming to fruition in Wales, is quite different from the English scheme, thankfully, and it is looking at least 10% of all farms being semi-natural habitats, and looking at how they can be connected up on a landscape scale for certain target species, including shrill carder and other things. So we're quietly optimistic, but like with all these things, Dave, a bit like with the elm scheme in England, it looked very positive until suddenly it didn't. And I too didn't think that I would necessarily be a strong advocate of Michael Gove at any point during my life, and it surprised me when he did so many good things as Environment Minister, so I'll give him his dues. I've got a couple more questions here. So there's a question from Marion, which it comes back to your original kind of sign from the university. So have you got any ideas about how we could encourage people to be less scared of wildlife, you know, in particular, obviously invertebrates?
Well, I think we need to somehow ensure that children don't are given an opportunity to interact with insects at an early age and allowed to continue that, so they don't grow out of their bug phase, so they don't become teenagers that are terrified of insects because they know nothing about them. They're kind of alien creatures. It's hard to do, but I'd love it if you know, a compulsory part of every primary school week was to take the kids out. I know forest schools have been really popular, but I think we could do more. And then when you get to secondary school, you know, most kids learn nothing about nature, really, as far as I can tell from my own kids who've recently gone through secondary school. I was so depressed because they, both of my elder boys, hated ecology at school. They said it was the most boring part of the biology courses that they did. And it was just totally uninspiring. They never got out. They never got to, you know, interact with nature through school. And that I think is really vital, that we somehow need to, you know what, it seems to me that this sort of understanding nature and how it works and ecosystems and how we grow food and how that is interwoven is about the most fundamental thing we ought to be teaching our kids. And I find it amazing that we don't, you know, we teach them all sorts of obscure stuff at school, trigonometry and Shakespeare and whatever, and not how to grow a lettuce. It seems kind of bizarre to me.
I completely agree. I think that's a really interesting point, actually, about, you know, these specific areas of study. So I think it's 2025, a colleague will correct me if I'm wrong, when the very exciting natural history GCSE will come into the curriculum. And I'm just hoping that it can be broad enough that it is not only talking about ecosystems and certain habitats, but groups of species, and making sure that people are aware of and, you know, and aware of their day-to-day impacts on, as you say, you know, things like buying of AstroTurf or glyphosate or whatever it might be. I think most people do this because everyone else does it. One of the things that's always interested me, well, not interested, but surprised me, was as a land manager and training to kind of use all these tools and pesticides and things, it amazed me to find out that the glyphosate that is sold in garden centres and you know, DIY stores, etc., is a considerably higher concentration than we're allowed to use either on farmed landscape or on nature reserves. And we have to be fully kitted up in PPE, masks and everything, and trained for more than a week to be able to use this stuff at a much lower concentration. So I find it really interesting that we give it to people to kind of throw around their gardens as if it's not a harmful chemical, when it is, you know, it's there ultimately as an all-purpose pesticide to kill pretty much most things it touches. So yeah, I'm with you on the ban of most pesticides. I can see my colleague Robert Mcgee, who gave the Pollinators presentation, has his hand up. So I'll ask Rob if he can ask his question, please.
Sorry, it wasn't a question. It was just completely to back up what Dave was saying with the engagement of children with insects. Some of our youth group members at the beginning of the project wouldn't have dreamt of holding any informative vertebrates. But some of the images I've shown are them holding moths, holding grasshoppers. And, you know, it's that kind of engagement and the confidence that they have now. I mean, one of the children didn't want to catch a single bee in a net, but by the end of the day was proudly walking around saying, I've caught 18 bees. And, you know, just that confidence from the beginning of the day, where he wouldn't even want to catch a bee, was proud to have caught 18. I think that engagement at an early age with insects and teaching them that actually a bee is not really going to sting you unless you try and harm it. And, you know, and that kind of the fear of moths as well is another one that is a strange concept to me, but to them, as long as you if they understand that they're not going to harm them and they can hold them in their hands, then I think that is a key sort of.
That's brilliant, Rob. I completely agree. Dave, there's a question here, and I think I'll broaden it slightly. Someone's asked about, would you recommend a garden pond for insects? And I suppose I'll just broaden it out to say, you know, what do you think are the key habitats that a garden should have to try and either cater for the most insects or to be able to cater for the whole life cycle of multiple insects?
Yeah, I mean, ponds are brilliant. Probably the single most effective thing to do to increase the number of insects in your garden, if you haven't got one, is to put in a pond. And it doesn't need to be big, even an old sink sunk in the ground or whatever. It's amazing how quick insects will find it. You don't need to put them in there. Literally with overnight, you'll often find pond skaters have flown in, water boatmen and so on. But there's loads of other things, obviously, you can do. And sorry, another little bit of self-promotion. My YouTube channel has lots of ideas for everything from bee hotels and earwig hotels to the best plants to grow and everything else. But yeah, grow native wildflowers, hedges rather than fences, have a compost heap, don't mow too often, try and create your own wildflower meadow instead of a lawn if you can. Don't, of course, use any nasties in your garden. Oh, actually, if I could just quickly flag up, beware also, we've got some research coming out on the impacts of these flea treatments that people put on the neck of their dog and cat. Those are insecticides. In fact, the most common flea treatment is a neonicotinoid insecticide banned in farming, but you can still drip it onto your pet. And if you want to encourage insects in your garden, I really don't think that's a great idea. So just beware, and I'll keep an eye out for our work on that coming out fairly soon. But yeah, the other positive things I said, it's really easy to encourage loads of wildlife into a garden. Even just a few nice plants, a viper's bugloss flower, when it flowers, with dozens of insects on it of loads of different species. You only need a few, a square meter, and you can attract lots of insects. So it's easy, really.
That's brilliant. I've got two more. Sorry, I'm furiously trying to make sure I'm getting across people's questions and trying to listen to answers. So one from John P here says, I understand entomologists are a rapidly declining species as well as insects. We need insect population monitoring. How can we raise the number of monitors given that insect identification is difficult?
Yeah, there isn't a simple solution. I mean, the reality is actually that there's spectacularly little monitoring globally of insects. There is literally no long-term data for any insect species from Asia, Africa, and South America, which is probably where most of the world's insects live. And we have no data at all. It's all the data we have are from Europe and North America, basically. And then for a really narrow range of easily identified and pretty insects, mainly butterflies. It's got the beginnings of a bee monitoring scheme run by the Bumblebee Conservation Trust. There's a moth recording scheme in the UK, but most countries have little or nothing. And it's really difficult because most insects are just impossible to identify without killing them and using keys to key them out and so on. So it's actually, massively challenging. I think all I can suggest really is that people join, if you're interested in insect monitoring, and it is really important that we know how they're doing, then join one of the existing schemes for the easier to identify insects, the butterflies, perhaps the bee walk scheme, and learn to identify bees, which is manageable. It's pretty challenging, but you can do it. And then at least we'll have good data for some insect groups. Realistically, it's a professional job to monitor, the more tricky to identify ones. We can't, I don't think, invent a citizen science kind of approach that's really going to work for most insects. I wish we could.
As Andy said during his talk, we're I think there are about 2 or 3 people in the UK who are known to be experts in some of the invertebrates that we're capturing. And that's why we're packaging them up in jiffy bags and sending them down to Cornwall. It's not just to send them on holiday for the summer. It is because there are so few people who can actually identify these things to a high degree of certainty within a sensible timescale. Just on that, I suppose a quick, maybe final question is, with techniques such as eDNA, do you see this as kind of friend or foe? Because I know that obviously for some entomologists, it's kind of going, oh God, I've just spent the last 20 years learning how to identify these invertebrates by their genitalia, and now someone's gone and sequenced them. So is it a good or a bad thing, or is it, everything has its place?
I guess it has to be a good thing. It makes me twitch slightly. I wish it wasn't necessary, but it does theoretically overcome, you know, some of the things I was just saying about monitoring. I mean, if it were affordable, theoretically, we could monitor particularly aquatic insects over the UK really easily by just sending water samples from every pond and river to there's still a bit of kind of snagging to be done. I think they seem to occasionally flag up entirely unlikely species as being present. So I think it's not fully functioning as yet, but it's potentially really exciting actually. That I find it mind-blowing that you can literally, you know, take a few drops of water out of a pond and it'll tell you there's a great crested newt in there, and along with 100 different species of insect or whatever. You know, how can there be DNA from all those creatures just swirling around in the water? You know, it's very odd, but it seems to more or less work, and it could overcome some of the problems we have with setting up long-term monitoring, I guess.
On that, unless anyone else wants to put their hand up and ask Dave a final question, I think as I spoke too much earlier and have made everyone overrun, I will probably pass back to Mark, our chair, and ask him if he can finish the meeting. But Dave, thank you so much for taking the time to join us tonight and for a fantastic talk and for answering our questions. We really appreciate it. So,
absolute pleasure.
Round of applause from me and everyone else here, I think.
Thank you much, Adam. Yeah, I just say thank you to all of our presenters. And this is just a small snapshot of what we do at Gwent Wildlife Trust. So if there's stuff that you're interested in, you want to hear more, please do kind of contact us, because we're your trust, we're your charity. If we're not doing what you want us to do, you need to tell us. We're happy to kind of do more of these sessions for you, just to kind of engage with what we're doing and what we're trying to do. We're trying to make a difference. And I think this has been fantastic, great engagement, great questions, and I will close the AGM at this point. Thank you very much to everybody. Thank you.